a sequence history was a big part of how you conduct a risk assessment. Can you just describe that a bit more?
The first assumption that underpins this is that you learn more about a person by hearing the minute details of something that's actually happened in their life than asking them to speculate or summarise their experience in some abstract way. So the most suitable focus for that fine-grained analysis of an experience is usually something distressing that's happened in their life. You'll learn more interesting things when you talk about something bad that's happened to somebody on average than if you just talk about an ordinary day in their life.
But the best way to understand that is to find, I think, the start point of the story where things just start to simmer into some kind of emotional predicament or difficulty and track that through sequentially. And I often think of it as though that it's like a narrative that has a beginning, a middle and an end. There's some sort of crescendo or upstroke of the story as the crisis builds up, and then there's often but not always a resolution of some kind. And perhaps this is what you were saying before, but I want to know moment to moment how things shift across that story. And it's when you look at the relationship triggers in particular, who said what to who and what the emotional reaction was to that you can actually learn the most about the forces that drive the suicidal or self-harm thinking.
You ask people to tell you the story, they'll usually start halfway through.
That's right. Yeah.
And a lot of the work is getting them back to the beginning. And sometimes that's a bit arbitrary because there's no actual beginning point. But I kind of think of it as like what you're doing in your sequence history is charting the course of a storm. And we want to get back to calm waters before the storm's even begun to happen. And because I reckon a lot of the critical information that helps me to make a formulation is what happens in those seemingly fairly quiet moments at the beginning of the storm. That's often more informative or as informative compared to what's happening right in the midst of the storm.
Actually, oftentimes in what we think is the aftermath, waters that appear to have settled are actually a riptide of some form, because the kid's concealing, or the young person's concealing a level of distress so that the family can regain their equilibrium, and making sense of that can be pretty helpful too.
Yeah, which raises another issue, which is that, instead of being frightened when people engage in suicidal behaviour or other distressing behaviour, we should see it as an opportunity, because it's a crisis in the family's life, and crisis is a time when change can occur. So part of charting that sequence history is to see, well, what might have been done differently to have made that take a different course. And families often see that for themselves. They'll often recognise that there's something that happened in the course of that event that could have been done differently.
It can be a real moment of change, can't it? I find one of the things about doing a suicide history or a risk assessment in this area is being prepared to go into the nitty-gritty detail about the thoughts of death, the method of suicide, the emotions that stirred up. And I want to emphasise that, because I often get the feeling that people worry that might stir up more risk for the young person, whereas my experience has been that it tends to be more containing. The fact that you're prepared to, in some sense, pull up a deck chair in the valley of death and sit there for a while is actually reassuring.
The suicidal crescendo can often act like an anchor point in the conversation, an established piece of the story which can be returned to when necessary. Generally, however, we reach a point where the narrative might threaten to stall. What you can use here is a gentle assumption, intuiting and tentatively proposing based on the information offered so far. Aside from the tablets, how often do you hurt yourself in other ways? How often do you cut? There's an assumption that something is happening built into this kind of statement. The assumption can be comfortably debunked by the young person if it's inaccurate, but at the same time it has the effect of giving permission to share gritty reality rather than defend or minimise. A related approach is sometimes described as denial of specific. With this approach, you have a list in your mind of possible modes of self-harm or suicide and confront the young person with them, Again, gently, but one by one. Have you thought of other ways of hurting yourself, like driving your car off the road? Pause and wait for the young person to answer that question before you move on to the next possibility that's in your mind. Have you ever tried to hang yourself using a rope? You're being very specific in a way that tends to invite more honesty than a general survey question might. Have you tried other ways of hurting yourself? No, says the young person. With this last one, blunt, inaccurate denial seems more likely. Another technique is symptom amplification. Here we deliberately overestimate the frequency, intensity or pain associated with a part of the suicidal story. We're essentially jogging the young person into a space where they're more likely to provide an undefended, accurate estimate of their experience. Thoughts of suicide, are they continually on your mind? Every hour? Once a day? And so on.
You can't do a suicide and self-harm history quickly. You've got to be prepared to open up the story and hang there for a while, really get into quite a lot of detail about it.
Absolutely, and I think that the empathic experience for the young person, the validating experience of having somebody listen so carefully to their story is vital, but also airing the story, I think, is potentially therapeutic in itself. So that while this is fragmentary thoughts, imagining going on inside the person's head, I think it's much more potent, distressing brew once it's brought out into the open. It's kind of like you oxidise the story a bit, and it maybe doesn't feel so frightening to the young person. It's something that can be put into words. Their experience before they talk to us about it is often that it can't be put into words.